Okay, what we have discussed so far is the definition of the entity relationship diagram and the symbols. Now, what I'd like to talk about is the attributes. Remember that in an ERD, or an entity relationship diagram, we have entities and we have here attributes. This is what we call an attribute K, or key attribute, attribute 1, all the way to as many attributes as the entity needs to have. So in effect, that the entity again constitutes information, the attribute constitutes data. So when we look at attributes, in other words, you have to think of an attribute as a data element. And then we have three types of attributes. Attribute number 1, we have a primary key attribute. Attribute number 2, we have a regular, if you want to call it, attribute. And third type of attribute is a foreign key. The primary key, which is underlined by a solid line in an entity relationship diagram, the primary key is an attribute that is a unique identifier. It's a unique identifier. The regular type of attribute, they are attributes or data that belong to each other and that describe that entity, such as, in this case, example could be a student, and regular attributes to a student would be student name, student address, and so on, student gender, and so on. Now, a foreign key is not shown in ERD, but a foreign key allows you to associate, two entities with each other. Okay, I would like to continue with the foreign key, and I'd like to show you here how does the foreign key work in associating two entities. Now, I'd like to stress that foreign keys are not shown in the ERD, but rather they are shown in the step after the ERD, which is the RSD. For now, I'm just using it for illustrative purposes. So let us consider the entity 1 related to entity 2, and just for being able to contextualize, we'll call this a student is given an advisor. It's for registration. So of course we can imagine that entity 1 would have entity 1 attribute key entity 1, I'm just using in generic terms, attributes 1 all the way to entity 1 attribute n. These attributes for a student could be, of course, student ID, student name or student first name, student last name, student middle name, student maiden name, student gender, student address, and so on and so forth. Same thing for advisor. We have entity 2 attribute key. Now, don't get confused. I put ATT here and AKA alone here. It's just representation of what it could be. This represents what in reality could be advisor ID. And the same thing, we can have advisor, or to continue being consistent, entity 2 attribute 1 all the way to entity 2 attribute n. Now we can say that one advisor is given many students. So we know that the relationship is 1 to many. And each student has only one advisor. So the relationship with the maximum cardinalities is 1 to many this way. So now, the question would be that if I am to relate those two, there's something that should be in common. Whenever there's a relationship between two entities in this world, something should be in common. What is in common? In effect, without going into more detail, we will elaborate that later on. We take the entity 2 primary key and we add it here in this entity. In essence, if I just expand it, I call this entity 2 AK. Entity 2 AK. This and this are the same. Why? Because in this entity it says that the student with a unique identifier, in this case student ID, whose name is this, whose address is this, whose, so we identified all the information we need for the student, has advisor with an advisor ID this. It's the same thing. In here, this is the primary key. In here, this is the primary key. And this is the foreign key.